issues more explicit in the presentation. So we're going to be looking at a range of, looking at the way in which the ethical issues and political issues emerge in encounters with others through research and a range of different practices. And I think what's interesting about this session is we have a number of international practices which we're going to talk about. We spent a lot of time talking about local practices, but on this panel we have some international practices as well in the context of this pursuit of the equal city. So I'd like to start with a paper on the dilemmas and reflections in the building of an ethical lexicon. This paper will be given by Yael Padan, but Jane Rendell and Yael Padan from the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL are the team that are leading on the work stream focusing on the ethics of research practice in the KNOW program. And they've been developing a very interesting and innovative line of work there. This is what I think Yael is going to share with us is one dimension of that work. So over to Yael.
Thank you very much, Karen. So I'm going to... Sorry.
We have Jane Rendell on the internet on Skype, so she'll be listening to the session and perhaps have some issues to talk about.
So thank you very much. So I'm going to share some reflections on approaches to conducting ethical research on urban inequality in diverse cities. We focused on three themes: the formalization of institutional ethics procedures and protocols for conducting such research, the need to move away from ethical frameworks that emerge from Western structures for knowledge production, and the tension between universal and specific approaches to ethics. In our work package, we question what ethical research is, can shared values be arrived at, and how do they affect the possibility of knowledge co-production and its potential to generate pathways to urban equality. So my work in KNOW is in work package 3, which is dedicated to the ethics of research practice and is led by Professor Jane Rendell, who will hopefully join us by Skype soon. The findings from workshops and interviews that we conducted with researchers participating in the KNOW program from all partner cities underscored the problematics of institutional research ethics and the complexities of knowledge co-production. They highlighted the need for alternative engaged ethics that are situated and relational, and for a collective discussion and reframing of some taken for granted universal terms and principles. So our work is informed by philosophical debates concerning applied and situated approaches to research ethics. Institutional research ethics procedures are rooted in the social norms of Western modernity and apply legalistic and medical approaches based on three main principles of minimizing harm, informed consent, and protection of privacy. These principles relate to Western modes of thinking about ethics. And so informed consent and privacy protection are rooted in deontological ethics, which follow a universal moral code. And the principle of minimizing harm is abstracted from consequentialist or utilitarian ethics, which focuses on outcomes and ends-based thinking. Another branch of Western ethics is virtue ethics, which is person-based rather than action-based, emphasizing human characteristics and social skills. And for negotiating the co-production of knowledge, the area of care ethics opens up spaces of deliberation about relational aspects of research partnerships. So scholars have questioned the relevance of legalistic or medical principles and guidelines for evaluating qualitative social research. A range of ethical challenges are involved in qualitative social research, and particularly in the context of researchers from the global north working in the global south, ranging from power inequalities and cultural differences to oppression and exploitation. A fundamental ethics question, therefore, is: what does it mean to produce knowledge that does not reproduce colonial, race, and gendered power relations in the academy and beyond? We suggest that the institutional abstract principles, formalized processes, and guidelines provide little guidance and tools for handling the muddles or mess of human interactions and the dilemmas posed by everyday ethics. In light of these problems, we aim to develop a type of ethical methodology for researching the issues of urban inequality. We use case studies and lived experiences recounted by our colleagues as a departure point for understanding the relations of theory, principles, and context in ethics. The experience or case study is a useful methodology for understanding ethics. Life experiences and situations can help to identify and think about principles and values, and they can also generate theory. Arguably, the blind spot of the lived ethics experiences that we have gathered is the questionable assumption that there are shared standards, principles, and concepts for understanding, relating, and comparing them. Given that values are socially constructed and norms vary in different locations, the conditions for having shared values and principles must be further discussed. Nevertheless, a case-based approach is useful for recognizing differences and inspiring a search for alternative or multiple concepts and their definitions. A helpful way for us to think about alternative principles and concepts has been to pose the question, what does ethics mean to you? To members of the No team from the partner cities in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Europe. This question addresses personal values, but also highlights differences between formalized ethics and lived experience, and between personal, social, cultural, and geographic positions. Our question was posed as part of an exercise during two different workshops. The first was conducted last year at the No annual meeting in Havana in February 2019, which brought together 50 team members from the different partner cities. The second was conducted in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in July 2019, during a workshop with a research team assembled by the Center for Community Initiatives, CCI, in which the discussions and responses were translated from Swahili. Participants in this workshop were a mixed team that conducted community research and included NGO staff, university graduates, residents, members of the Urban Poor Federation, and local government officials. The aim of our workshop, entitled Ethics in Color, was to explore existing ethical terms, to add new meanings and concepts, and describe experiences and dilemmas. We used color as a means to encourage spontaneous, immediate, and intuitive replies. In contrast to the institutional, carefully worded research ethics principles, we were interested in finding out whether shared moral intuitions are possible across cultures, and whether they can form alternatives to the institutional ethics vocabulary. The responses in both workshops were focused mainly on words concerning interpersonal encounters and relations, rather than on the institutional type of terms. In the first workshop, they included words such as integrity, transparency, respect, balance, harmony, care, and more. We then asked the participants to use color wheels to classify and group the words. And some of the categories that they suggested were relations, context, personal process, politics, and values. In the second workshop, participants came up with some identical words, including respect, honesty, confidentiality, responsibility, and other words were different, such as love, patience, listening, and discipline. As for the categories, only one was similar, that of practices, and the rest were different, including passion, fear, and morals. The question remains whether these similarities and differences point to universal or specific terms. What is the role of culture, language, and translations? Translations were discussed earlier in one of the sessions, but now an interesting example is about the word consent. So in the first workshop, it was given an institutional definition. So consent means agreement by the research participant to take part in the research. In the second workshop in Dar es Salaam, it was defined in terms of the researcher's willingness to abide by social norms. So consent is to be involved with the community. It is ethical to join them in what they do if you are invited. For example, eat together if you are offered food, participate in their activity. Participants were also asked to share their experiences of ethically important moments. In both workshops, some experiences were about relationships with research participants and the complexities of managing expectations, building trust, hearing multiple voices, and dealing with group dynamics. Other experiences related to ways they perceived moments of misunderstandings and disagreements. For example, in the first workshop, work in a settlement where a corrupt local official wanted to use the university's work to their economic or political benefit. I went to meet a local group, and before I could even say anything, members wanted me to first help resolve their leadership problem. And the second workshop, tenants being uncomfortable or not feeling free to give information when their landlords were there. When asked to answer a household questionnaire, the respondent said, "Every day you are coming with those questions. I'm tired of answering questions." The difficulties of collaborating were raised as well, and particularly in a mixed global North-South team. For instance, in the first workshop, an important moment in the inception of the research project, defining the theme and allocation of resources implies huge responsibility. Who benefits from it? Or retaining commitment to a research partner when the rest of a bigger research team wanted to drop them in the face of adverse conditions. In a collaborative research conducted in my country, one of the northern partners visited the research site without my knowledge, and I was only informed later. Within the No project, our work package has focused so far on work with city partners in Dar es Salaam and Kampala. We began assembling a bibliography of African scholars who address issues of research ethics. Although it is questionable whether there is a single set of philosophical and ethical principles common to all African cultures, an examination of approaches to research ethics that differ from the Western cultural concepts is crucial for co-producing knowledge. In the context of research ethics, this debate questions the relevance of Western individually based ethics principles in different cultural contexts. One of the outputs of our work package will be a co-produced lexicon of words and concepts that frame our research, based in part on the terms and categories suggested in the Ethics in Color workshops. We want the lexicon to highlight differences in meaning, allowing for discussions that aim to better understand the role of situated and engaged ethics and to reflect about ethics as a practice. Lexicons and glossaries are often used as research tools, especially by people working across disciplines through practice and in modes of collaboration and participation. The task of co-producing a lexicon entails thinking about the multiple cultural and linguistic ontologies linked with the lexical entries. So as argued by Moltmann, lexicons are based on the ontological categories, notions, and structures that are implicit in the use of natural language. That is, the ontology that a speaker accepts when using a language, unquote. The ontology-dependent meaning of a lexical entry is termed by Simiano and his colleagues an ontology lexicon. They argue for a dynamic rather than fixed set of word senses, allowing for lexical meanings to be added as required, so that the ontology supports a generative process by which further aspects of the meaning of a word can be derived from the ontology, unquote. In his book Keywords, A Vocabulary of Culture and Society from 1975, British scholar Raymond Williams examined words that reflected and highlighted problems, tensions, and disagreements represented by the vocabulary. He explained, "This is not a neutral review of meanings, it is an exploration of the vocabulary of a crucial area of social and cultural discussion, which has been inherited within precise historical and social conditions and which has to be made at once conscious and critical." His project was followed by 2 subsequent books, New Keywords and Keywords for Today. Carly Coetzee titled her introduction to a special issue of the Journal of African Studies about North-South academic collaborations, Ethical Collaboration, Keywords for Our Contradictory Times. In No, we have an opportunity to question how to use our lexicon as a tool for facilitating ethical processes of co-production across diverse contexts. We propose that it is useful to supplement written text, which is the core of most lexicons and keyword projects, with visual and material tools. We have used color wheels and colors, co-produced drawings, cutting and collage as methods that encourage engagement and participation. We find such visual tools useful as modes of inquiry, of representation, and of dissemination. They offer creative ways to try and extend beyond the limits of language and translations in exploring and discussing ways for ethical knowledge co-production. Thank you.
Thank you, Yael. Very interesting framing of our session. But we're going to move on to a slightly different context now, which is the practice context. Alex Apson-Frediani is going to talk to us about participation as planning, ethical considerations around the limits of planning, based on a paper by him and Camilla Corsina. I'm not going to introduce you more since we met you earlier this morning.
Hi. Yep. Is it work? Yeah. Great. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be part of the panel. We'll be talking more about ethics of planning practice in this case. So it's very connected, I think, to the discussions. And it's emerged out of a paper that Camila and I were working in trying to articulate this relationship between participation and planning. So we were trying to reflect about the contributions of trying to explore this relationship between participation and planning from a southern urban theory perspective. And I'm going to try to then introduce some of that arguments and then and share with you some thoughts that if we interrogate some of those perspectives from an urban equality kind of lens, what are some of the ethical considerations that we should be talking about? So, as I said, the motivation, this is the paper that it was been already published, and it was part of a special issue that is focusing on debates around participation and planning. And the argument that we were presenting there was trying to articulate the notion of participation as planning and not necessarily in planning. And I think I'm going to try to develop this argument and then also think about the ethical considerations of it. So the critiques of participation in planning, I think, has been clearly outlined this morning. Catalina and Vanessa, in their presentation, they already outlined some of the key limits of participation in planning. And I think in current debates, there has been a lot of issues around the ideas of participation and how it might not be able to recognize different relations of power, to address some structural challenges. And I think part of that critique is an uneasiness to understanding of planning in itself, that a lot of the debates around participation in planning understands planning as this statutory government, the so-called the invited spaces of participation in planning processes. And the critiques are there, and it's very robust, and I think there is already a strong set of arguments in there. And as part of a response to that, we also have seen an increasing amount of reflections talking about adversarial planning, talking about insurgent planning, thinking about conflict planning. So there are a series of different alternatives to the discussion of participation and planning that is out there, and we wanted to make to dialogue of those and make a contribution to these current conversations. So when we started interrogating this relationship between participation and planning from a Southern perspective, we used a lot the work of Gautam because we feel that this articulation of Southern perspective as a relational concept and not necessarily as a geographical concept was fundamental for us. And so Southern perspective is more than a set of locations. It is an ethos of inquiry in which place matters, that can be seen as a periphery, a relational geography. It is not just a collection of previously underdeveloped countries or the boundaries of the post-colonial world, but a dynamic and changing set of locations. So in this sense, for us, this really questioned the notion of planning itself, and as he later developed in the introduction to the Routledge handbook around planning in the Global South, and that really asks planning to go beyond just the invited spaces and start stretching the concept of planning, that we need to understand planning practice beyond that the entity of the state, and we should start incorporating other dynamics and other forms of practices as planning practice themselves. And I think by doing that, that's the kind of set of discussions that I want to engage with, and that Camila and I were trying to articulate from that perspective. By doing it, then the Southern perspective around the relationship between participation and planning, I think, brings to the forefront that the aspect that participatory practices that emerged, embedded in particular locations, they are challenges to some of the limits of the dominant planning thinking and practice. They come about because of some of the limitations of the so-called dominant planning perspectives. And therefore, planning emerged as a set of collective practices of city making. And by doing that, we believe that then some blind spots start emerging that hasn't been necessarily captured in a more systematic way in the planning literature around forms of doing planning that goes beyond that statutory practices. And we identified just 3 different types of practices that emerge out of the exposure that both of us have had in our own practice, and we describe them as collective production of urban space, partnerships from grassroots organizations, and claims and recognition of rights in the city. So what I'm going to try to go through now is each of those different practices that we articulate in the paper, and then ask the question: what are the ethical considerations to research and practice brought about by the lens of urban equality, if we try to understand them? So the first one around the collective production of space, this has been also shared already. We've seen the substantial work that, for example, the federations of the urban poor are doing internationally, that collectively doing reblocking exercises, enumerations, interacting collectively in the built environment from their own perspective, from their own practices, often not engaging with state actors or private actors, sometimes responding to some of those dynamics, but actually doing by themselves. So there is a process of production of space that is collectively, and they are actually responding to the inadequacy of planning instruments. They are saying, well, the planning instruments here in this location, they don't talk to us, they don't respond to our needs and our aspirations. We need to get matters in our own hand. We need to start engaging in planning ourselves. And that's, that's not an isolated case. The Asian Coalition for Housing Rights has several or different examples. The whole notion of the social production of habitats that also has been articulated within the Habitat International Coalition network as all forms of trying to illustrate that forms of collective production of space. But when we bring an urban equality lens, this would generate a set of questions in relation to the inequalities within communities and among communities. And that has been well documented, for example, in the case of Old Fadama, the challenges that this posed, for example, for members of federation and non-members of the federation, or in the case of Kenya, the work that Stefan and I and many others have been reflecting about the challenges around structure owners and tenants and some of those inequalities. And that actually, it brings difficult questions around who is benefiting from some of those grassroots practices, who is being left behind. So in this case, there are ethical implications here. If this is a form of planning, then how do we ensure that those inequalities are not being reproduced? The second set of practices that we try to articulate in the paper is around partnerships from grassroots organizations. And of course, here we were very much inspired by the Orange Pilot Project that has been a milestone in some of these processes where communities engaged with private and state companies in different contexts around delivery of water sanitation facilities. And they establish a partnership with different actors of the city. And that comes about also as a response to the limits of neoliberal governance and how we see the privatization of different forms of services and housing provision, and that is not actually benefiting the poor. And they decide, well, we need to make our own organizations and we need to establish those partnerships to try to actually improve the responsiveness of different systems. In the case of Kenya, for example, in Nairobi, in Kisumu, where I've worked for 4 years with a few trips with my students, we saw a lot of this happening, and through a mode of delegated management model, where we have a set of partnerships between collectives in informal settlements with the water service provider, where then they give them bulk water and to this neighborhood association, and then afterwards they distribute water within the community. And this is the kind of collaborations and partnerships that have been actually very meaningful, because it was able to supply water, in this case to informal settlements that previously were not having access to water. But at the same time, this also generates a set of ethical questions. Out of the work on urban equality lens will generate a set of questions associated to the asymmetries of power in the partnership between grassroots groups and private and state actors, which generate an unequal distribution of benefits and burdens. This leads to ethical implications to the potential of exclusionary forms of inclusion, because in this case have actually those inclusions been reproducing other forms of exclusion. And this relates directly to market-based approaches to service delivery that can perpetuate exclusionary and exploitative relations. I think the work that we've done there, and Stephanie Butcher has written a really strong report in trying to explore some of those tensions, because we start seeing that those water points that were, in the case of Kisumu, that was closer to the roads, those water points that was closer to areas of commerce and for better off parts of the community, actually were able to survive. And while in other areas of the community where it was actually much more costly to maintain the pipes, and where you have more vulnerable communities, those water points closed down. So we start seeing that actually this market-based approach to delivery of water services in this case has actually perpetuated some inequalities within the community, and also generated new responsibilities that for the communities were difficult to bear. And at the same time, the water company was not given the type of subsidies that would be necessary for communities to be able to absorb some new responsibilities. So complicated questions around ethics again, around, okay, this is a form of planning, so how do we engage with it, making sure that those injustices are not being perpetuated through this process of service delivery. Finally, the third form of participation as planning that we've seen, we documented through this reflection, is around the idea of claiming and recognizing rights in the city. And here we've seen a series of practices that have been using the legal routes, the courts, the judicial system, to be able to not only claim their rights, but actually to produce the city, producing the city as a way to claim legal rights. And this has been very much the case in São Paulo, and in other contexts where there has been a response to abusive planning practices. Clearly, planning practices, dominant planning practices that have been violating particular set of human rights recognized in country constitutions or in international conventions and commitments, and therefore using planning system in itself was not enough, because that would therefore perpetuate those types of violations, and only engaging to the judicial structures was a way that those rights could be claimed. In the case of São Paulo, we have a series of occupations of vacant buildings where people have been utilizing those acts of occupations as a way to claim those legal rights and activating a judicial process. So the act of production of the city is an act of producing a legal procedure. And I think that's a very interesting form of participation as planning, which is engaged with the legal structures. There are many other examples of this type of processes happening around the world. In Lagos, where we've seen the federation, actually a part of STI network, that have been using legal procedures as well, with paralegal activities to try to respond to evictions. Yael on practice in Jerusalem, that has been really important, I think, for us as well, to highlight some of those rights-based approaches that is very, I think, very inspiring in terms of illustrating the potential of judicial processes. But at the same time, we also wanted to highlight that the urban equality lens would generate a set of questions associated to the potential threats that human rights-based approach can generate. As it become at times, a human rights process can also become more conflictive and more confrontational. Urban equality would generate the recognition that different groups would be exposed to different level of consequences to a right-based claim. To some, this could lead to direct loss of lives. In the case, for example, in Lagos, we've seen that this mode of confrontation actually led to direct confrontation with the states and deaths by many of the urban poor. So here we also face some difficult ethical considerations to planning practice in terms of who is being exposed to such practices and with what consequences. Just as many feminist work have highlighted that within the unequal households, women suffer the most out of the breakdown of collaboration, within highly unequal cities, the poor will bear the consequences of the breakdown of collaboration. So at times we talk about conflictive planning, but I think a lot of that literature comes from a very less unequal type of cities. And I think it's much more uncomfortable to talk about conflict in situations where actually the consequences of it can be very strong to the people that are in the front line. In the case of Brazil, for example, many of the people living in occupations actually are Latin Americans or actually African migrants that are not necessarily having the same citizenship rights as the Brazilian citizens. So once you engage into that confrontational form, you're asking to be evicted. Then what happens to those that do not have the rights to be included in the, for example, the housing program Minha Casa Minha Vida, which most of the articulation is around being included in a housing program by occupying a vacant building, but those that actually living in, some of the people living in that building that are putting themselves at risk are not the one that are bearing the benefits from some of the outcomes of those direct action. I think these are some of the uncomfortable questions that we need to think about also around the ethics of research, because they relate to the ethics of practice. Just to conclude, because my time is up, and that's my last slide, I think that this reflection around the linkages between participation and planning and reflecting about the ethical considerations coming from an urban equality perspective, we try to summarize into 4 different, let's say, 4 different notions or ideas that it's actually is not necessarily new, but I think it's in tune of many other articulations or ideas of planning and what it should do. And I think for us, yes, definitely, the idea of historicized consciousness is something very important. That it's about deepening that historical understanding of the place. It's about putting learning at the center of any planning process. It's about opening up possibilities, scenario, and opportunities, and not a means of resolving problem, but also this encounter between participation and planning, I think most importantly, is about articulating alternative imaginaries for the future. And yeah, it would be great to discuss some of the implications of these reflections with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. For our next paper, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Amanda Flaherty from the UCLG, the United Cities and Local Governments. So we move to the international level, but also very much linked to the local level, local government level. The UCLG has a number of committees that are organized groups of local government members that get together to work on specific policy areas. And in this case, Amanda is leading the Secretariat on Social Inclusion, Participatory Democracy and Human Rights. And her talk, which I hope we'll have up shortly. Okay. It's all right? Can we move ahead? Okay. Okay, are you sure you wouldn't like to give us a stick? That maybe we can do it in the meantime? Okay. I think that what about if we move to the next presenter, and whilst you sort that out, the next presenter is indeed also talking at the national, international level. And the title of that session is There is Always Something Else, Reflections on the Relationship Between Urban ODA Research and Policy in the UK. It's going to be given by my colleague Colin Marks, who works with Christopher Yap from the DPU at UCL, and they're our team who are working on the stream that focuses on UK official development assistance, or UK aid, which we were looking at from the point of view of an urban perspective. So, Colin, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Yeah. Yes, so I'm presenting work that I've been working on with Chris Yap, and Chris can't be here because he's on paternity leave, but he's done a lot of the work, and Karen, of course, has been part of the discussions, although I'm not including them in what I have to say until you've heard what I have to say, Karen, then you can decide if you want to be. So what I have to say is my responsibility. So as Karen says, we've been tracking the history of the urban in official development assistance policy, UK official development assistance policy. And the reason we're trying to do that is because our part of the project is looking at the learnings in all the other work packages and seeing what can be taken back to London, what can be taken back to the UK. So in order to work out what can be taken back, we first need to work out what is there and how something might fit into what gets taken back to London. So in this presentation, what I'm going to do is just draw out a few examples from what we've been looking at. And what I want to do with these examples, is it in the right place? What I want to do with these examples is, I can hear the difference, is demonstrate the distributed nature of power relations and the ambiguities of ODA policy. And demonstrate those two things within an overall trend and trajectory that has two components. The first one is that we can't understand British ODA policy without seeing how it is linked to the colonial enterprise. And we can't move forward without acknowledging this. And the second one is to recognize that there's been a consistent focus on economic development. So it's very important to understand ODA policy, because within the context of a bureaucracy, a policy sets the parameters for action of the bureaucrats in that system. And it encourages, or at least discourages, certain forms of action. And so the argument that I want to make is that in a context where personalities, institutional imperatives, multilaterals, domestic UK priorities, policy commitments, policies, budget sizes, the demands and priorities from partner countries, and the politics in aid-receiving countries, in a context where all of those things matter, it's very difficult to see a clear link between research and ODA policy over the period that we're looking at. And this raises a number of ethical implications, and I'll draw out three. And those are the need to be attentive, nimble, and self-reflexive. So what I'm going to do now is go through three periods that we've identified. And before I do that, I just need to specify that what we mean by the urban, in this concept of the urban that we've been looking for in ODA policy, is that we need to recognize, firstly, that the notion of the urban has changed over 150 years. It doesn't stay the same. And even in the same period, people have different understandings of the urban. So the urban that we've been looking for is defined by the sense created by the No project of being an urban that attends to distribution, or redistribution, recognition, and participation. And the data that I'm going to present to you comes out of interviews with policymakers, officials in the development assistance world, archival research, and the analysis of policy documents. So the three stages, or the three phases that we identified are the following, starting in 1850. And in this first phase, there's very much a sense that any notion of the urban is very much implicit. And the way in which the urban emerges is through infrastructure projects that the UK government would have supported in different countries. So there are kind of infrastructure projects with no explicit spatial dimension or particular population. And what's emerging in this phase is that the policies are very much emerging out of the colonial experience. So you have the Prime Minister Gladstone saying in 1852, every question in which you cannot show an imperial interest shall be left to be dealt with and managed by the colonies themselves. And in this period, military spending is predominant in overseas spending. So in some years, out of £26 million, £25 million are spent on the military. And it's really in the post-World War II period that you see significant changes. One with colonies becoming independent, and the second with the Bretton Woods institutions emerging. And both of those two things dramatically reshape the aid landscape. In 1960, initially the OEEC and then later OECD emerge, and they start to define development assistance as being provided by official agencies, including state and local governments, or by their executive agencies, and each transaction of which is administered with the promotion of the economic development and welfare of developing countries as its main objective, and is concessional in character and conveys a grant element of at least 25%. And that's the definition that people have been using to categorize aid flows as aid. So slowly in this period, the urban, not our urban, that we might identify in this room, starts to emerge as a discourse. Books are produced by, for example, Mumford. the UN, the first international symposium on housing community planning in Delhi occurs in 1954. The Architectural Association establishes its Department of Tropical Architecture, which is the forerunner to the DPU. The UN Economic and Social Council establishes the UN Center for Housing, Building and Planning, also in 1954. And so, along with this kind of implicit engagement with the urban, there's slowly people and agencies and institutions emerging around urban issues. So, in this period, particularly after the Second World War, we start to see what we recognize now as official development assistance starting to emerge. The ideas that aid should be given to countries outside of the UK's control or influence starts to become consolidated, that it should go beyond economic development to include the welfare, and that infrastructure is a very important part of what should be focused on. Although in this period, in most of the development assistance is around building the economic productivity of colonies and ex-colonies to support sterling as an economic area. And in this period, the ODA policy is not research-led by any means. It's mostly focused or drawn from colonial imperatives. In the second phase, there's an emergence and consolidation of the UK's overseas aid portfolio. New institutions start to emerge, and there's a growing recognition of urbanization as being important in development. But in this phase, there's an important turn to a rural focus. So, in 1964, a big moment when Harold Wilson in a Labour government comes in and establishes the first Ministry of Overseas Development. There's a more of a commitment to development aid, an investment in institutions that are focused on urban issues, so IDS at Sussex, the DPU, and IIED all emerge within a few years of each other. In 1972, the UN Conference on the Human Environment suggests that planning is really important in human settlements. So all of these issues that I'm talking about are issues that the people who've been involved in official development assistance mentioned as important in shaping an urban agenda or the notion of an urban agenda. So in 1965, the ministry commissions the first large-scale urban social survey in Kaduna, Nigeria, and that was important in providing a template for other urban projects that then followed. What happens, though, in this period is that there's a call for a focus on the poorest of the poor, and that's taken to mean a rural focus. And so there's a strong push to shift from any urban investment or any promotion of urban projects into rural. And so the Minister of Overseas Development, Reginald Prentice, says in 1975, we want to see a shift from the urban to the rural sector, from large to smaller projects, from high to intermediate technology, and from capital-intensive to labor-intensive projects. Notwithstanding that, though, the urban issues continue to be part of the landscape, the ODA landscape, and projects that were happening in India, in Sri Lanka, in Egypt, urban projects continued to be implemented throughout this period. So in this period, what starts to happen is a growing cadre of urban researchers starts to emerge. And despite this focus on rural, these people are slowly starting to promote more urban and housing issues in the period. And still we see very little influence of research on on ODA policy. In the third period, sorry, so then, sorry, I've got a little bit out of sync here. So this is what I was talking about. So the World Bank comes in, talking about slums. We have UN Habitat, the projects that I was talking about in Egypt, India, and Sri Lanka, and then a number of conferences that are all promoting people looking at urban issues. So in the third period, we have this rise of the urban, as we would recognize it and appreciate it. And that's led by people who are sitting in an engineering division in DFID, which comes out of New Labour coming to power in 1997. New Labour making this commitment to engage in aid that's untied for the first time and that's focused on all kinds of development. So we have DFID emerging. We have Claire Short, an innovative minister who changes the programming from supply-led to demand-led. DFID takes up the UK government's place on UNCHS, which then becomes Habitat in time. DFID founds the Cities Alliance. It writes a number of reports shaping the urban environment, focusing on the Habitat agenda, and then most importantly, meeting the challenge of poverty in urban areas. And in this phase, two institutions are set up which continue to resonate today. One is the Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility, which is essentially a way of making countries and cities conducive to large aid flows by the private sector, and to be taken up by the private sector. And the second one is the Private Infrastructure Development Group, which is funded by DFID along with a number of other funders, and currently sits with a portfolio of 3 billion. And each year, the amount of money that DFID is putting into the Private Infrastructure Development Group vastly dwarfs what any money that's being put into explicit urban projects. So what this means is that the urban, as we might think of it, as being somehow focused on issues of distribution, participation, recognition, wax and wane as an object of policy of ODA, but underlying this is a trend or an effect. I'm not quite sure what to call it. That what the kinds of development assistance is doing is making the life of people intelligible and visible to new forms of capital. It seems to me that that's what it's doing, because what we've got to recognize is that while ODA policy is promoting a form of economic development which is often nakedly quite neoliberal, but not always so, it's also making a difference to people's lives. It's also providing water and housing and sanitation and all those kinds of things. So, in terms of ethical reflections, and to wrap up, I wanted to identify 3 things. So, the first was that ethics seems much more effective, or thinking ethically seems much more effective when it's very clear where the power lies. So when you have a situation where the power is really distributed between institutions and personalities and policies and budget sizes and bureaucratic processes and multilateral organizations, it's very difficult to work out where you stand and what you need to confront and where the harm might come and where the benefit might be. There's always something else to think about. The second is that ethics are much easier when the issues are binary. When you can say, okay, this aid policy is about aid tied to trade, so it's very clear what's going on. But it's much more complicated when the aid policy is ambiguous, that it's both promoting some kind of economic agenda, but at the same time, people are getting water or whatever it is. And then lastly, ethics seems much simpler or more straightforward when there's a grand narrative. When you can say, okay, well, this is clearly a neoliberal project. This aid policy is just about neoliberalism. But when when it's only a trend, when you can say, okay, well, what's going on here is perhaps that aid policies making and development, the development that flows from the aid policy is just making people intelligible, visible to capital, and that might be a good and bad thing, then it's much more complicated as to where to situate the ethics. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. So, if we could go into the final paper on motivations and strategies underpinning the UCLG Committee on Social Inclusion, Participatory Democracy, and Human Rights.
So thank you very much for this invitation. Actually, I will do my best because I'm not a researcher. I will bring to this table more the experience of the network I am working for. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time to sit down, write about all the processes we are facing and have time to think about it. So it would be a pleasure here to open the discussion with you and to have a dialogue on maybe on the experience I will share. So I work for UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments. It's a worldwide network of local governments. We call local governments, it can be cities, it can be a region, it can be departments. It's all the different governments who are under the central government. I think it's important to also to highlight that the work we do is related to the political sphere of local government. No? So my presentation maybe would be more oriented as an advocacy work. And I think it's really interesting. Thank you for kind of introducing also my presentation because in all the first ones I would like to share with you is the increasing role of local governments because one of the main purpose of UCLG has been to defend the place of local governments at the international stage. And I think it's important to maybe to explain you that UCLG is seen by the local government as their agora to discuss their preoccupation, on their initiatives, on their action, on their solution at the local level to face the challenges of the society. So I think it's important to say that UCLG is one of the only network which is not thematic related. We can talk about migration, housing, inequalities, women, and it's also a very wide. Oh, sorry, I don't have. Yes, it's also a very wide network where each local government has one voice. It means that Paris has the same voice as Saint-Denis, which is a peripheral city of Paris, and it creates a very democratic network, helping a discussion very open on all the different challenges. So UCLG was created in 2004. It was a legacy of previous network of cooperation between local governments, but one of the main purposes was to make a step forward on the recognition of the role of local government in international governance. It did so highlighting the necessity to include all the urban challenges in the global agenda and also by claiming for more recognition of local government as key stakeholders to lead the necessary transformation and achieve the global goals. That's all the evolution that we can see of the Habitat conferences. And the last one in 2016, Habitat 3, was the main conference which led to the creation of the new urban agenda. I will maybe have some time to explain a little bit about the new urban agenda and the dynamic was created, again, the coalition of civil society movements and UCLG as the representative of local governments. But we see that there is this increasing role in this increasing recognition of local governments in all the international level that affects the way that local governments are acting, affect the way they are seeing themselves and the way they are trying to find spaces to have actions at the local level. So all the structuration process of UCLG over the last decades is very interesting because it showcases very well this willingness of local government to be part of this international discussion. And we have gained as a network of local government much places in international institutions like in the UN. And I think it's also important to relate it to the two main phenomena that we all know. One is urbanization, with the main consequences is as it amplified all the urban challenges. No, we are facing unprecedented challenges regarding all the topic we have been discussing the last days. And it puts a lot of pressure on the local government, and they feel accountable, and that's the interesting consequence. No, it's how they feel accountable because they feel pressure because the challenges are growing because of urbanization. I would like also to highlight maybe a notion that I didn't hear that much on the last day, but we would like to highlight in the local government debate is metropolization. No, I was having kind of a debate with some of the colleagues here, but urbanization explain maybe the movement, but what we say about metropolization is the ecosystem within the urbanization process. No, how it reconfigurates the relations of power between the territories, and there is way more consequences, but way more than just urbanization. So I think that's it's also interesting to maybe to understand a shift in this evolution process of the recognition of the role of local governments that we have been talking for a long time of local administrations, and we're now talking about local governments, and it means a shift because when we talk about local administration, we're talking about entities who are implementing national policies with no judgment, I would say, and all the advocacy work around local government is to express the way some local governments are taking ownership of the challenges, are create their own agenda, their own strategies, and their own way to respond to the social demands at the local level. And in UCLG, it's very clear that we defend local government and not local administrations, for example. So I think that's all. Well, we know that the decentralization process is not the same everywhere. There is a lot of differences between the different countries. They don't refer to the same realities either. But it's a global trend, a deep global trend, that leads local governments to ask for more power, to more competences and more resources to be able to implement the public policies needed. So all this decentralization process is also very interesting on the way it reconfigures all the democracy processes at the local level. And actually, I'm totally forgetting to. Okay, so yes, so. Inside UCLG, I am working for the Committee of Social Inclusion, Participatory Democracy and Human Rights, which is a very specific space, which has a specific history that I wanted also to share with you a little bit, because talking about all the democratic processes and challenges linked to urbanization and to decentralization, some local governments in the late 90s and the early 2000s have been working at the international level a way to find a new path for new urban policies, a new way to think the relationship with the citizen, and they did so especially in the spaces provided by the World Social Forum in Brazil, in Porto Alegre. And from this experience, I mean, a lot of work we're doing now, so like 20 years after, still connected to all the discussion that happened in this moment, where you had all the movement of the alter globalization, who meets with this local government, no? And with this necessity to create innovative approach at the local level to change a little bit the game on how to respond to the challenges and to the social demands. So this need to address these deep changes was a way also to bring to the table the necessity to have a multi-stakeholders dialogue, and especially at the local level between academic, between civil society organization, and between local governments. So, I mean, until now, all the as I was saying, all the outcomes of these moments, special moments of the 2000s, is still here in the way that local governments are thinking innovative policies. I'm thinking especially about all the right to the city that has been already kind of described, but this relationship of with the citizens, no? And for example, I will just maybe made another comment on the right to city, because it has been a very relevant framework for a lot of local governments to say that it was important to put the needs of the people and then the rights at the heart of the urban fabric. And this, all the dialogue with the civil society has been able to provide a meaningful framework for local governments to transform their local policies and the public policies to respond to the demands that they were facing at the local level. So the Committee of Social Inclusion I am coordinating now was created inside UCLG because these local governments who were in Brazil, in all these spaces, wanted to share this experience with other local governments more widely. So the Committee of Social Inclusion is this space of meeting, of exchange of experiences, of sharing vision and how to create common knowledge on all the ways to create more human, more equal, more sustainable cities. No, that's what the common point between all these cities. I just maybe wanted to that's some information about the Committee of Social Inclusion. I think this process is really interesting because when we refer to the ethic and the lexicons, that was the main purpose of the session, it's really interesting to see how the relationship that has been built over the last decades between these different kind of stakeholders help to create new narratives, no? And the importance to create common narratives around the urban challenges. And one of the main outputs was also to get the local government engaged with the issues. So I don't know how time is it? 3 minutes? Okay, so I will just go fast. I wanted to show a specific example of the human rights cities movement, and I just choose this topic because we know that human rights has been very criticized as a relevant framework because of the use of the human right and the difficulty of the relationship with the UN also. And it's really interesting to see how local governments have been taking ownership of this human right concept and changing a little bit the way to use it and the way, the meaning they were doing. And I just put it here map because it's on the I did a map with the different initiatives. So that was in the 90s. I put then on the beginning of the 2000s, and then it's on yellow. It's the current dynamic, and it's really interesting to see how it started with very local initiatives that then they have been actually they have been connected from a regional perspective and then shared inside UCLG as an international commitment with a very deep work on how to understand the human right at the local level, dealing with the urban challenges. So housing, migration, women, and actually it led to the adoption by UCLG of a global charter agenda on human rights in the city. And that kind of process is really interesting to see how maybe tensions between universal values, for example, and the way that local governments are using it as a reference, but at the same time changing a lot the way they are worked at the local level, no, and providing meaningful input and very concrete way to working at the local level. So. Yes, I will not go further. So, do I have still 1 minute? Okay, perfect. So I just maybe just to finish a little bit also on this relationship with the ethic and the lexicon, which I think is very interesting to see how this dialogue between the different stakeholders provide common narratives that has been at the heart of all the work we've been doing on housing, for example. It's a pity I don't have more time to explain you a little bit about this work, but I think that one of the tensions we have is how we can create international and common narrative, but respecting all the local specificities. That's a huge challenge. And on the housing issue, for example, it has been really hard to find a balance where we could have common messages shared by local governments, because of course from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, and from South America is absolutely not the same way to see this challenge, but at the same time it's a global challenge because we have common trends. We have a financialization of the housing market, which is having consequences everywhere. So it's all a balance on how to find common narratives on the problems and specific response on the solutions. That maybe it would be the way to make the balance. Thank you.
I'm hoping that Jane Rendell, who's been listening and will be the discussant for the session, is with us. Okay. So Jane, are you with us?
I am indeed.
Okay. So we have 10 minutes for some feedback. Jane Rendell, been listening and will be the discussant of the session, is with us.
Hi.
Jane, can you please turn off your live stream?
Hi everyone.
Okay.
Hello.
So Jane, are you with us?
I am indeed.
Jane, did you switch off your live stream? We have 10 minutes for feedback. Can you switch off your live stream?
Sorry, there was some very strange doubling.
Your live stream.
Okay. Okay, that's better.
Jane, please close the YouTube.
Very helpful advice of turning off the
Close the
live stream.
YouTube.
Hello?
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Jane.
Okay, is that working fine now?
That's good.
Okay,
You can
great.
turn off your camera.
Well, very exciting papers. Thank you so much to Karen for putting the session together and to all the speakers. The content of the work itself is really, really interesting, but also really appreciated the way in which you then, Amanda, Colin, Alex, turned from what your particular study was to try and think that through the work that Yale and I have been doing around ethics, but also Amanda at the end, and I'll come back to that, thinking about the lexicon in particular. So I think it's a really, really productive and exciting session. And what it really highlighted for me was the kind of hunch that Yale and I have been working around, which is this idea of ethics as a kind of practice. So we don't really see it as a form of research we're doing, but as a kind of practice, or perhaps even research into a form of practice. and that itself being a form of practice. It's a way of doing things. I think that's really important. I think that comes through the papers that were given. And I think that I originally put down, it's not a set of rules, but I don't think that's quite right. I think it's about how practices evolve, ethical practices evolve in response to a set of values or principles. And I think it's interesting to reflect upon whether we start with a set of ethical values or principles and then play out practices against those, which is very similar to the way that theory often dominates practice. And I think what we've been much more interested in, and what I'm hearing as a much more dynamic thing coming through the papers, is this idea of generating commonalities that come out of the practice. So, I mean, if we were to think in one way about the practice of ethics, we might be taking ourselves quite deep into political philosophy, which I think is very important. But I think it's more about thinking about the ethical dimensions of practice. So I was very struck by Colin's discussion of ODA and its relationship historically to these different versions of colonization, but particularly how aid gets configured differently historically. And I think aid is a really interesting ethical practice. I'll come back to aid in a moment. I also think the examples of participation that Camilla and Alex raise, and thank you for the amazing paper you sent me, and these questions of rights and confrontation that come up in your work, which clearly demand a much closer look, perhaps, at the relationship between ethics, politics, power, justice, human rights in particular. And I think sometimes I worry, and it came out in a paper that I gave recently, a question that I was asked about the relationship between ethics and politics. And I sometimes get concerned. We see a real rise in the discourse around ethics, which I think is a very positive thing. But I also think sometimes in neoliberal context, perhaps the institutionalization of ethics in university committees and so forth, what we see is ethics being used in the place of politics. And so it's a form of depoliticization, and that does concern me. So I think these discussions that were coming through here about power relations perhaps can balance that out. And I thought particularly, Amanda, in your paper, your discussion of advocacy, dialogue, these different modes of engagement across levels of local, national, international, questions of scale become absolutely key. So just to say a little bit more perhaps then about these issues of scale and practices of ethics. I think one of the things that Yale and I have been very interested in the project, in interviewing people, but also I'm hearing in your papers are often these tensions between universalism, universal human rights, and specificities, and often wanting to tend towards the situatedness, the specifics. What gets lost in doing that? I mean, there's a very strong set of feminist responses to this. I mean, those are the ones I'm familiar with. There's also a very strong set of responses, obviously, through decolonial discussions as well. But in the feminist literature, you have both a rejection of universalism, rejection of this idea that the white man stands for all and the erasure of difference that produces. And some, like Saila Ben Habib, for example, and her work on situated knowledge is talking about a revaluing of universalism, not a whole-scale rejection. Whereas you have other thinkers like Iris Marion Young, who are much more skeptical around abilities of universalism and much more interested in difference. One way through this, which I think, I don't know whether I'm projecting it onto the papers that I heard, but I also feel that there's work we could do together around this, is this interest in care ethics. So I think care ethics negotiates the relationship between universalism and specificity in a very interesting way, because it puts the focus on applied ethics and ethics as a practice, but particularly a form of work that operates between individuals. And I think that is a helpful way that we could start to think about some of the different case studies that we were hearing in the panel. So care ethics draws out differences between caring for and caring, taking care of, relationships between caregivers and care receivers, and around particular types of theme, responsibility, which came up, attentiveness, competentness, responsiveness. So these are all very interesting terms for thinking through in much more detail terms of engagement between different participants, perhaps from Alex and Camila's paper, through to the term stakeholder that came up in, I can't remember, it's Colin or Amanda. And I just want to say, to wrap up, a couple of things more around this idea of relational practice, because I think that can be a helpful way of conceptualizing ethics. So in the longer paper that you sent me, Camila, you and Alex worked through a shift between participation in planning to participation as planning, and also work about participation to work through participation. And I think these shifts, they seem very linguistic, but I think they are very helpful for thinking about materialized practice as well. So what does the shift from in to as produce? Well, if we think about ethics in a sense, as its simplest definition would be relation to the other. So it's about intersubjectivity. So relation as would force us to think as the other, so to think in terms of the other. So I think what that does is start to put the researcher into play. And I think this is really important for the work, that the researcher and the researcher's context and politics, particularly within the North-South dynamic, needs to come into the frame of the work. And I think very interesting issues then emerge around recognition, reciprocity, identification, and so on and so forth. And then just to end, about thinking through the other. So the other move that you make in the paper is thinking or working through participation. Not doing research about participation, but doing research through participation, participatory research. So I'm very interested, a lot of my work is around psychoanalytic practices, and I'm very interested in the concept and the practice of working through. So working through engages many of the difficulties and problems that often get suppressed or pushed to the side or pushed underneath in some senses, and it kind of demands a recognition really of what it means to work through problematics. And I think throughout the papers we heard many of the different problematics, and what excites me, I come from the School of Architecture, and this work that we've been doing in No, engaging with participatory planning and so forth, has opened up to me a new community of researchers, and I really, really respect the way that people are engaging all the time with incredibly complex and difficult questions, almost like drawn towards the difficulties. So, I mean, one of the key difficulties that we face in working through, because working through demands a materialized engagement, is climate change. So I'm not with you this afternoon, sadly. I'm stuck in my flat in London, not in Bangalore. I would love to have been there with you, but I made a decision in September this year. I've been trying to reduce my flying for 10 years, managed to about half my carbon footprint by travelling by train, doing Skype and so forth. But I made a decision in September to completely stop flying. Now that makes it much more difficult to work out how we do this working through. Technology offers all kinds of opportunities, only really when David Heyman is working with technology, but it offers also huge problems of surveillance and lack of control over individual data, lack of consent, which are key ethical issues.
Jane, can I ask you to draw to a close, because we would like to take some comments and questions from the floor.
I'm done. That's okay. As far as I wanted to go. I did just want to say one thing more, which came out of Amanda's paper, which I was very excited about. which was this idea of a common narrative that respects specificities.
Yes.
So at this one point, we've got a lot of difficult work to do in the working through in terms of what the challenges that climate change offers research practice and the ethics of research practice. But I think the potential of creating common narratives is a kind of a nice way of balancing that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Okay, so folks, I'm sure there are other questions from the floor. So can I open it up now? Either questions or comments.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. My question, Colin, is for you. When you're describing the shifts in aid policy over the years, can you elaborate a little bit on to what extent these shifts were discussed and took into account the preferences, the realities, and the needs expressed by the aid recipients? And as these policies evolved, was there any concerted effort by the UK government to reach out to the countries that aid was going to and bring them into the decision-making process of what these priorities were going to look like, or how that aid was going to be delivered?
Thank you. Any other questions to pick up?
Hello, my name is Snehashish. I'm from the National Institute of Advanced Studies. My question is to Amanda. So thank you for the presentation. I was wondering about this particular issue of fiscal autonomy of the local governing bodies. Like in India, we have had this long-standing issue where the autonomy of the municipalities are very limited and they have to depend on the state governments for the funding. I just want to know that your experience of similar instances in other countries, and were you able to figure out a way to intervene and chart out a way for fiscal autonomy for this local governing bodies? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
I just want to ask the lady, Jane, about the issue which emerged very strongly in Dar es Salaam about the cultural-based identities, cultural-based ethics, where culture plays a very important role in defining the type of, or even essentially framing the ethical aspect of, especially in localized situations. And I wonder, I didn't see it very clear. Did you get my question?
We can't hear? You're talking about the role of culture.
Yeah.
Yes.
How it influences the ethics and whether it has any implication in terms of how you define ethics in a community.
Okay. Any other questions? There are a couple of hands here.
Just very nice to each other. A super quick one to Colin. I was just reflecting on, I guess, the post-2003 story, in a sense, after what you and Chris sort of detail and Karen detail. And maybe a bit speculating, but I'm wondering, the argument being ethics are clearer and sort of more manageable, perhaps with a stronger global or international agenda and narrative. And I'm wondering if sort of the quiet rise of the early 2000 is in fact a little too quiet, or the urban agenda isn't in fact a strong international agenda or narrative. So the ethics connected to that are in fact pretty weak because the agenda isn't as big as we make it in sort of working in that kind of area.
Thanks everyone. Sorry, I'll just be very quick. Thanks everyone for the panel. Question was prompted by Colin as well. I was wondering, when you were charting those different versions of the urban through time, whether particular definitions of the urban change the kind of ethical, political question that Jane's raised there, that relationship between ethics and politics, and perhaps also it's also a case for the rest of the panel. I mean, Amanda, you talked about sort of urbanization and metropolitanization. And I was wondering what difference it makes to use these different categories of the urban and what they might mean for how we frame the kind of politics ethics relationship, if anything, if it makes a difference or not. Thanks.
Thank you for the presentations. There were actually two moments that triggered my question. One was kind of articulated by everyone and has been throughout the conference, which is the tension between universality and specificity. And the second one was, I'm thinking about this in the context of what you mentioned, Alex, about claim making and making claims to rights in the city through confrontation. And I'm wondering if we can imagine an ethics and a politics where empathy becomes an organizing principle. I don't know if that's too vague, but that's something that I've been thinking about, and particularly for collective bargaining and collective demand making.
I think there's a range of really interesting issues here. I think what we'll do is what we've done in the past. I'll just go ask each person to pick up the issue that you want to pick up on, and perhaps I'll start at the other end. So, Colin, there were quite a few questions for you.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So, were countries involved? Yes, they are involved. So they're involved. There's a process. So before aid can flow in any way, people in DFID have to engage with the country government that they want to work with. So if it's India, okay, so they'll start typically at least 2 years ahead. It takes 2 years to put all the paperwork in place for aid to even begin flowing in any kind of way. And so that right at the start, there's a negotiation between DFID, probably through DFID India, with the government of India about whether they want a certain arrangement of things. And at that point, the country government that's going to be the recipient of the aid has a chance to say, yes, we want this thing, and without that, I forget, there's a particular name for the document, I can't remember what it is, but without that agreement right at the top, nothing else can happen within DFID. So there's that moment. But what complicates that story is that the DFID central London is almost seems divorced from the country offices, so the country offices can do kind of what they want. So there's also a negotiation that happens with the country offices in each country, and there are plenty of stories of. I have friends who were in the Dar es Salaam office who couldn't get to talk to the Tanzanian government. They weren't even interested in talking to DFID. So I think it's a complicated picture of that. So why post 2003? So we have data post 2003, but for the purpose of the presentation, I cut it at 2003. I think that the ethics are in some ways would become clearer because it's very much we're moving to more of a market-led. It's much more clear that it's market-led, and so in that sense, it might become a little bit clearer. And then there would be different ethics that go through those different phases. In the first phase, if you think about it largely as of aid supporting infrastructure for specific projects, being the one, then the second phase being around housing and sanitation, and this third phase, which continues now, which is very much about market-led development. And so each one of those would have different ethical implications.
Maybe so to answer your first question, actually a lot of countries are not yet arrived to a good process of decentralization, and I mean most of local governments in the world has not the necessary competences, not the necessary fundings, not the necessary responsibilities to respond to the local challenges that I was explaining. In the case of India, I would say that, well, the interesting thing is like it seems that the regional state has a lot of power, And for example, in the framework of UCLG, we would consider them as a regional government. So some stakeholders that you can work with in order to respond to these challenges. They will definitely enter in this category. I think that, well, I've not been studying it, but my personal feeling is that there is a strong connection between the level of decentralization and the capacity of cities to be a democratic entity close to the citizens. I mean, that's one, I think it would be important also from civil society and from social movements to fight more on the decentralization process and on having more powerful local governments. And I'm just thinking about the presentation we had 2 days ago on eviction, where I was asking who was deciding the evictions, and the person was answering me that it's an agency, a housing agency. That's for me, it's an issue because this agency has no elected representatives. It means that you cannot, as a citizen, put pressure on them because they're not accountable. If you have the housing competence decided at the local level, it means that you can build a relation of power between citizen and the local entity that change totally the way that you are thinking about the challenges. I think also that maybe to respond on your question about the way we think about urbanization, I think it's central. The way you analyze urbanization configures totally the way you create the responses. And for example, if you analyze, if you miss, for example, the governance analysis in the urbanization process, you are missing a lot of challenges. And I will just give one example. For example, when we were in Medellin with Catalina last year, if informal settlements of the cities consider that they are part, for example, of the metropolitan area, they should be part of this governance. And these doulers would organize themselves to have a representative and negotiate that this representative could be at the municipal council, for example. It would change a lot the way they are considered because they would be parts of the metropolitan area. So if you don't think about, for example, the governance, if you don't think the relation of power between the different territories inside the metropolitan areas, you're not seeing this issue and you're not responding to it. So, and that's, I think that's important, the way you are, yes, characterizing this urbanization, no, and in this way. And just, I wanted to add another point, sorry, I will be very short, because I missed it in my presentation. I think it's important, because we also need to understand better all the evolution process regarding the responses of all these main challenges. And for example, if we take local democracy or women or housing, the responses provided 30 years ago are not the same that the one provided now. And we need to provide also an analysis on this. I think it's really important because it shows the evolution of the ethic also. If I take a very short example on citizen participation, the first wave, the local governments were dealing with citizen participation. It was just informing them about the decision. And then they decided to make consultation. So citizens could explain their point of view, but they could not decide and could not choose. And right now we are in the phases of co-creation, to co-decide, to make the choice of the cities. And that's a very deep change. But we're always talking about the same topic with citizens' participation. And we need to have this analysis of the evolution on the way we're responding locally to all these challenges.
Yeah, empathy. That's my only kind of. Yes, it's. I empathize. I empathize with you, but maybe I don't do anything about it. So I think that's the risk of empathy. I think that in itself, it can also lead to passivity and I think acceptance of status quo. So I think we need to watch out. And also empathy with whom? Empathy came to the English vocabulary just in the beginning of the 19th century. And it's a recent word. And there are other words that describe issues around respect, solidarity, that we might want to use more strategically because this empathy has been also applied to understand, for for example, Holocaust people that have been part of the Holocaust, and then and actually we empathize with the with the people that have perpetuated such atrocities, and they need to empathize with them. So I think that it's a complicated word and concept. I think that we need to watch out for.
Thank you. So I'll be very short. I think it turns out more and more that the role of culture in ethics is very central. So the question that came up very clearly in the workshop in Dar es Salaam is whether the difference are because of translation from language to language, or whether it is a deeper understanding or difference in understanding. So this relates to the question whether ethics can be based on principles or the interpretation that different people have on principle. For example, all of us agreed that consent is important, but the way that UCL sees consent with the forms and the very long reading and signing process is not at all relevant for the way that the participants saw this word. So I would kind of join Alex in saying it. One of the options is to base or to kind of think about it in a more culturally aware way, is that ethics can use the option of care, of solidarity, maybe not of empathy.
So folks, let's take that as a proposition to think about. And thank you so much to everybody. But we're running into the next session, and I do think we should stop here. Jane, if you don't mind. Teeny. Okay. It should be teeny, okay?
Teeny. Just to say, I loved the question, the last question around, I think the speaker said, what would happen if ethics became an organizing principle? Was that right?
No, what would happen if empathy became an organizing principle? And Alex responded to that, yeah.
Yeah, so I think I would say what would happen then, perhaps I'm reading into it, if ethics becomes an organizing principle. And I think what that would then demand is a much more careful look at these different forms of relational practice, from solidarity to empathy to responsibility, which I think can be also a very, very helpful one. Because I think if we ignore the emotional register of the work, I think problems emerge. I think we're seeing that globally now, that we have to deal with structures of feeling and affect.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So thank you, folks.